Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Alternate Media Book Club. We have a special guest tonight as we review the book Besorah by Mark S. Kinzer, and also basically Russell Resnik, I believe is how you say that name. We got quite a bit to go over tonight. This book has a lot of interesting bits and pieces that we definitely want to cover, some good, some bad. You know how it is, how we do things here. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and bring my guest on. But once again, welcome to the book club. So, Mr. Bobby.
Hello, hello.
If it isn't the meme lord himself.
Well.
How are you tonight?
I'm doing outstanding. Yourself?
I'm good. I am. So I saw you're enjoying a whiskey tonight. I'm just doing a beer today. I have like just a little bit of beer left before Passover, and I'm just trying to get rid of it. And yeah.
Hey, you got to drink it when you can.
But the whiskey's expensive, and I'm not about to drink a ton of whiskey in a very short period of time.
That's wise. Yeah, I'm enjoying Tullamore Dew.
Ooh, good whiskey. Good whiskey.
Yes.
So, let's see here. I had the wrong banner up, but that's fine. And also, it's a little quiet, so I'm going to try and get some background music here while we're going. I just have to upload it. We've done a little, as you can see, we've done an overhaul of our studio setup, and so we've got some new things. But
Looks
anyway,
good.
So you actually have a physical copy of the book in hand, right?
Yes. I generously was awarded this by a lottery system. I hear that Patreons get put in a drawing to win a book. Be the lucky winner.
Yeah, actually, that's funny. I forgot that we sent you that book.
Yes.
I actually don't have a physical copy. I have the Kindle version. I'll be honest with the audience and yourself, and you already kind of know this. I usually don't buy Kindle books unless I don't feel like I'm going to get a lot out of it. So usually my Kindle books are things like Harry Potter,
Right.
you know, stuff that I rarely pick this thing up. I do have some stuff on here from when I deploy for when I want to read something, you know, that is on my reading list. Like, you know, I do have E.P. Sanders's book up on here, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, stuff like that. And so when I bought this book, I was like, I'll just get the Kindle version because I feel like it's, you know, I'm just going to read it and see how it is. And I will save whether or not I was correct for the end. But instead, we'll jump right into the review section. So let me pull up here let's see here. Introduction. Yeah. So I'm trying to find it. So this is why I like having background music for those silent moments. Okay, so what I like to do is go through just chapter by chapter. Just a quick like kind of overview so people have an idea of what to expect in the book. For those who have not read the book, for those of you who are joining us and you have read the book, these are sort of like refreshers, reminders, things that I'm going to say maybe you forgot, but, you know, just a refresher reminder.
Sure.
And I'm going to, like I said, I want to get this music up because it's embarrassingly quiet. So
I could sing, but we don't want the viewer count to go down.
It's fine. You have a pretty face, so just
Thank you.
Stay quiet then. No, so this book is divided into 3 parts, I believe.
Yes, 3 parts, 10 chapters. It makes it very, very easy to read. Yep.
And so part 1. Let me see here if they have the introductions to part. In the overarching, and feel free to disagree or add your thoughts to this.
Sure.
But the overarching theme to Basora by Mark Kinzer. So first of all, this is actually sort of like a watered down version of his original book, Jerusalem Crucified. And he goes over that in the preface, him in the introduction, him and Russell talk about how Mark is not really good at writing books for easy reading. It's not really his niche. Niche, is that how you say
Niche?
that?
Yeah.
English is like my third language or something. And so Russell Resnik kind of steps in and makes it a little easier to read. So the content of the book is primarily from Jerusalem Crucified by Mark Kinzer. And then Basora is a much more user-friendly version of this book. Anything to add to that, or?
No, I mean, and ironically, it's on the front cover, Basora, the resurrection of Jerusalem and the healing of a fractured gospel. And I didn't realize how much emphasis was going to be on that first part about the resurrection of Jerusalem. So I think a lot of my presuppositions going into this book was, this is going to be a retelling of how salvation works. As soon as when you die, where do you go and how do you get there? And kind of like the traditional, maybe an evangelical or a Jewish version of that salvation message. Whereas he's trying to fill in like a fractured road that has some potholes where it's like, hang on a second, there's a whole other part of this gospel that extends further than just the traditional gospel.
Yeah, I mean, the word itself, Basora, is the Hebrew word for gospel.
Yep.
Well, basically, it's not exactly, but gospel, from evangelion, the Greek, and they go over this in the introduction. Basora is sort of evangelion is what the Septuagint translates from Basora, which is sort of good news or gospel, or so it's kind of working from there. That's why it's called Basora. And yeah, I have to admit, going into this, I thought this would be more of a retelling of the gospel itself. It's sort of like, this is the gospel, but from a Jewish perspective, here's like a correction of the gospel. Mm-hmm. And so, you mentioned that, and there's a massive focus instead on the parallel with Jerusalem, like as an entity, which it's different. It's not something that I'm used to seeing or hearing. I think Mark S. Kinzer, I think he knew he was treading in water that was not quite common water, really.
Mm-hmm. Right.
When he was doing this. Let's see. Let's pick a good song. Coffee break. That sounds good. Let's do that. Let's see if that works. Excuse me. So, but yeah, 3 parts. And so part 1 is it's 3 chapters. I think it's just 3 chapters where we're focusing on just the Jerusalem crucified part. And let's see. There we go. Yeah, coffee break's playing now. Let's go. All right, no more dead space. Sorry about that. And just real quick, by the way, everyone, feel free to ask any questions in the comment section. You can be part of this too. So part 1, the Basora of Messiah and Jerusalem crucified and risen. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a good summary right there. It's this idea that there's a parallel that Yeshua represents more than just himself in the gospel message. He is sort of prototype for the city itself.
Yeah.
Which I'll admit is not really something that I've thought about a whole lot, in the past. Making that sort of connection. I feel like I've always sort of known it, understanding that the true gospel message is really central to Jerusalem as a focal point for everything. Of course, Jerusalem, the Messianic era, and everything like that. And it's key focus, but sort of replacing Yeshua with Jerusalem in like the gospel message is not something I really thought of doing. This book, I think, attempts to do exactly that.
Well, especially because, for the past 2,000 years, give or take a couple, Jerusalem, it kind of fell apart after 70 AD. The temple was destroyed. People were scattered. It's not always on the forefront of the mind when you're talking about, what is the good news about it being built back up.
And it's really funny you say that, because as soon as you say it, it's like, why didn't I see it before? Because like Jesus dies and like really early at a young age, and he doesn't come back for a long time. And then you're like, well, Jerusalem gets destroyed, and the original gospel message gets sort of lost, and the city doesn't come back for a really, really long time. So there's actually like just right away. It's one of those, I see where he's going. But he does talk, like he does give an introduction in chapter 1 to what the gospel message really is, like in a much more Judaic perspective. I think he does a good job at spending a couple of chapters here kind of reminding the reader what the gospel means to a Jewish audience, which was its original audience at first, before it became heavily not Gentile focused, heavily Gentile inclusive.
Sure.
Yeah, to the point where like there's almost no Jews in the faith anymore, right? So, but yeah, so that's chapter 2. I actually have something highlighted in the chapter 2 section where he sort of expands on the definition of the gospel. So he starts with the gospel from the Messiah. Chapter 2, he begins to expand on the concept of, the gospel. And he's going to lean very heavily on the book of Luke for basically this whole book. And that's going to be one of the things that we talk about later, things I like. Actually like that he focuses on Luke. And we'll get into why in a little bit. But yeah, so this is where he begins to draw this parallel. He begins to expand the Basora to like the city itself. And then chapter 3, the resurrected Messiah and Jerusalem, he continues to work with this concept of putting the two in parallel to each other. He's going to talk a lot about Peter's sermons from Shavuot, from Pentecost, a couple of things written from Paul, to kind of wrap this whole thing up. Of course, Acts is going to play a big part in this book too, because Acts is really just volume 2 to Luke's first work, more or less. And he points that out in the book too. And that's another thing I like, actually. That's one of the things that I really, if I were the person who canonized the New Testament, if it were up to me, I would have put John before Luke and then have Luke, Acts together. Like personally, because they really are meant to sort of, in my estimation, be a lot more flowing from one into the other. And so I think by putting John after Luke kind of interrupts that flow.
Oh, a spacer of sorts. Yeah.
Yeah. So reading the New Testament from front to back, like most people might, you will lose touch with the flavor of Luke. Then you have the flavor of John still in your mouth, and then you get to Acts and it's Luke's flavor again, but by then you've forgotten what it tastes like, so you kind of have to.
Would you call it Luke 1, Luke 2, or Acts 1, Acts 2, or would you keep the names?
I'd keep the names. But I think maybe an introduction, like a flyleaf between the two, like volume 2 written by Luke, Acts of the Apostles,
Well, doesn't Exodus sort of start in a similar way, where it starts with and, like a conjunction, like we're continuing the story. Part of Genesis ends, and then it picks right up. It's as if they're kind of tied together.
That's a Hebraism anyway. It's weird. Like in English, it's not really proper to start a sentence with the word and, but in Hebrew they do it all the time. Like Vayikra, right. Like the first word of Leviticus, Vayikra. And he called. And it's like, you can't start a whole book with and. But yeah, it is it is a kind of a nail that connects the two. The vav is nail, right? It connects.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm sure you know where I'm going with that.
Yeah. It is the topic.
So that's part 1. Do you have anything you want to add as far as part 1 review?
Just for chapter 3, what I really liked is they flirted with the idea of the fall festivals finding its fulfillment when Jesus comes back versus the spring festivals kind of when he came. And so there's also kind of a connection there.
Part 1, part 2, you would say.
We might say.
Let's see. Yeah, and the only piece I have highlighted is from actually I already went over it. Okay, so part 2 of the book begins in chapter 4. And I'm just kind of part 2 is interesting. I read part 2 and personally, like, I have almost nothing highlighted in all of part 2. So the nice thing about the Kindle is you can consolidate all your highlighted passages and just go through them one by one. And I think I have literally nothing from part 2 highlighted.
Really?
Personally, yeah. There's some things I didn't highlight because the community highlighted them. The Kindle will also show you like popular highlights from other people.
Oh, that's kind of cool.
And so there are things like, 13 people highlighted this passage in chapter 7 or whatever. But me personally, I had nothing in part 2, so nothing really stood out to me as being particularly like standout-ish, I guess. But these chapters explore the outworking of the Basora as presented in part 1 regarding the people in the land of Israel represented by Jerusalem. We begin with a discussion of the temple, which is the heart of Jerusalem, is a key to its significance, as well as its future. Then we discuss Luke's emphasis on the calling of the Jewish people, which entails the continuing role of the Torah as Israel's covenant document and guide to communal life. So, by and large, this is going to be a sort of a case for Torah in part 2, more or less, and how, I guess, like, how it is still not only relevant but important to the overarching gospel message,
right?
And that's continuing on with this parallel that he's making between Jerusalem and the Messiah. So, excuse me, chapter 4, the Holy Temple in Scripture. And like I said, I don't even have anything highlighted from this chapter.
The only thing, well, one thing that I liked, it talks about the cubicle shape of New Jerusalem, kind of as a massive holy of holies, where you can almost imagine a chiastic structure where in the Garden of Eden, it's like a temple where Adam and Eve are acting as priests. And then there's the fall. And then at the end of all things, you have God dwelling with man again. And everyone in Jerusalem, specifically the Jewish people, acting as the priesthood. So it's kind of cool. The beginning and the end. Jesus.
That's all in chapter 4, or is that really mostly just part 2 altogether?
I mean, that particular highlight I knew whenever you said, I think chapter 4 is the one about the temple, and it talks about the temple is always pointing towards a higher reality.
Oh, yeah, yep.
That is in the Holy Temple in Scripture chapter.
Yeah.
Well, the first part I talked about, the Holy of Holies, is in the Holy Temple, and then the quote about pointing to a higher realities, chapter 5.
I was going to say, so chapter 5 is Luke's portrayal of the temple. This is really a continuation of chapter 4. That's why I was wondering if that whole thing was in. You'd think I didn't read the book. I read the book like in December, and then I did like a speed read through for tonight. But chapter 5, it will continue to bleed in. But now we're going to focus on, not really focus, but we're going to talk about Stephen's speech in Acts 7 a little bit, and the continuing significance of the temple in Jerusalem, not just in Jerusalem. Just from sort of the way Luke, I guess, talks about this connection. This is not in the book, but you're going to see this concept in the book. I heard this, I think, from Rabbi Kaplan of Chabad in Flamingo, which is in Toronto, Canada. And he would say things like the temple in Jerusalem is where heaven and earth kiss. It's the only place on earth where heaven and earth are basically touching. And so, it's like the whole, God and man reaching out, the God's hand. And so he was like, it's a beautiful picture, because essentially he was saying that Jerusalem is that. It's Jerusalem is the limp hand, and God reaches down at Jerusalem, and that's where the two touch at the temple. And so that sort of focus you're going to see is very prevalent in Judaism as a whole. And so that's why the author sort of has to go through like seemingly painstaking effort to try and get a Christian reader to understand the significance of Jerusalem. You look like you had something to say?
No.
You like took a breath, open your mouth, and then. So chapter 6, the Jewish people and the resurrection to come. So this is where we start to correct a lot of misunderstandings. Now, there's a lot of that throughout the entire book, especially since he's basically taking the time to redefine, really break down it's one of those, in order for words to make sense, sometimes we have to make them not make sense and then rebuild that word back up. So we throw, like the word gospel, we throw it around all the time, and so it's one of those, well, once you can illustrate that even people who use the word don't really understand what they mean by the word, they just sort of have this idea and they take it for granted. So you break down the structure of what they were sitting on, and then you build back up from nothing to redefine it in such a way that, all right, now this fits and it makes sense, versus my thoughts of it before were really clashing in certain areas. So he does that throughout the book. And chapter 6, you're going to see this. So the Basora goes out to the Jewish people in a mission distinct from the mission to the Gentiles. So we're going to talk about that, you and I, later. I have your show notes, and that's one of the things that we'll be talking about later.
Sure.
Sorry?
No, I just said sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we're going to talk, again, we're in Acts. We're going to talk about Acts chapter 3, Acts chapter 28. Chapter 7, the Jewish people and the Torah in the Basora of Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, Basora of Luke. So once again, we're refocusing. The author is kind of going through great pains to shift the gospel message back to a Jewish context, to the Jewish people. In part of his introduction, some things that he brings up is, when a Christian tells the gospel message, it sounds like hell to a Jewish person. And a good example, I'm not even sure if this is in the book. I think I read this somewhere else. But if you ask a Christian to describe heaven, you'll likely get the best answer for what hell looks like. And it's this idea of like, well, everyone goes and they worship, and your free will is gone, and it's just perpetual bliss or whatever. And it kind of sounds like, well, actually that sounds like hell. It sounds like not fun and not good. Of course so he's going to do things to break down some of the concepts here. And I want to emphasize too, not in a heavily scholastic way.
Right.
Yeah, this book is very user-friendly. I think, in fact, it's so user-friendly. There are parts of it I don't like, because I think Russell takes a lot of liberties in some of his dramatizations in the way he describes things.
Oh, I liked how he painted the countryside. He's like, you can hear the birds. I was like, yeah, I feel like I'm there. Like, this is great.
And I'm over here like, this is a waste of my time. I'm trying to learn. So yeah, there's some things like that. Do you have anything to add for chapter 7?
Chapter 7?
Yeah, I've actually got a highlight in chapter 7. So
I don't think I have anything in chapter 7, unless, is that the one, the Jewish people and the Torah in the book of Acts?
The Jewish people and the Basora of Luke in the Gospel of Luke.
Okay. All right. I'm in the next chapter. No, I don't have anything highlighted in chapter 7.
Yeah. Well, so he basically, at the end of the day, he goes to essentially argue that Luke is presenting Jesus as a Torah living Jew, a Torah fulfilling Jew, in both teaching and practice, and that he's teaching Torah essentially. Some of this is pretty basic stuff for those of you who've been in the Messianic movement for a while, but a lot of this is going to be important for someone still new to this stuff before they can move forward. So in chapter 8, the Jewish people in the Torah in the book of Acts. And this is the last chapter of part 2. And something I just have highlighted here from his introduction, Luke portrays Jesus' followers, like Jesus himself, as faithful to the Torah from the beginning. And this chapter covers 2 passages often employed wrongly to argue against the validity of Torah. So this chapter kind of gives a brief overview of Acts chapter 10 and Acts chapter 15. Basically, once again, part 2 didn't have a whole lot of highlights in there because this is stuff that I already knew. I have a solid foundation in a lot of this already, and I have those highlighted information in other books, where it's a little bit more thorough when talking about Acts chapter 10, Acts chapter 15, and other stuff like that. But if this is your first book where you're seeing these arguments for the first time, like say you're new to the book club and you didn't read Restoration with us, then you're unfamiliar with these arguments, but you should have. Yeah. So unless you have something else you want to add, we can go into part 3.
We can go right into part 3.
Very well. The Basora, present and future. And this is where we kind of circle back to the focus on Luke and his voice of his voice of Jesus's message, right? And I say that because each of the Gospels has a different sort of voice. Center that camera. What you need is a bookshelf in the background.
I know it's the picture frame throwing me off.
This is Luke has a particular voice that he gives to Jesus, right? And the reason I say that is that's not like unheard of. I'm not speaking blasphemy. That's a very historical way of reading the Gospels. Is that like Mark is recording Jesus with a particular goal in mind, with a certain focus and focal point, with his message being one particular way, one aspect that he chooses to focus on. Same with Matthew, his aspect is different with a slightly different focus. And Luke's same, John, there's all the Gospels, there's no exception to this rule when it comes to the Gospels. They all have their different voices. And Luke's is particularly prophetic. Luke sort of gives Jesus the voice of a prophet, if you will. And the reason I say gives is just like Acts chapter 2, we have the speech from Peter. Acts 7, we have the speech from Stephen. If you look at those books and you analyze the Greek, you're going to notice that they're very similar. And that's because Luke probably authored those speeches based on what was actually said by Peter and Stephen and everything. But he was not recording word for word what Peter said exactly.
There's a fancy word for it. I can't pull it out of my hat of vocab words. There's a word that means like the definite exact words that he said versus like what he said in a general sense. Yeah.
I can't remember it either. But Luke does this a lot, especially in Acts, where he compiles the speeches together based on traditions that he's collecting, and he likely authors the speeches, in that he wrote it, but he's writing what Peter essentially said, and it's highly structured. It's really well, carefully put together. So that gives us an indication that he's received these traditions and he's recording them as he's gotten them. And this is very common. Every historian back then did this. This is not like something new to the Gospels or something out of the ordinary. Every ancient document does this in a sense. And so the same is true with Luke, when he puts words in Jesus' mouth. When Jesus is speaking in Luke's gospel, he's working off of traditions, right? We have Matthew and Mark to correlate, multiple attestation, if you will, a similar source. We see that there's a lot of overlap, but Luke's voice in his gospel for Jesus is unique. And so we're going to get a little bit more into that on how Luke focuses, what his goal is in his portrayal of the gospel, and why he has given Jesus the voice that he has given him. So yeah, chapter 9. Presented in Luke Acts. He's calling Luke Acts as a single book, which is apropos, as it should be. It's really 2 volumes of the same work. But yeah, so we're talking about prophetic. So the return of Zion, excuse me, the return to Zion in light of the Basora. There's a little bit more prophetic stuff. And then chapter 10, Messianic Judaism and the restoration of the Basora. So this is future. So this is that present future part 3 is only 2 chapters, fairly short. And with the goal of healing a fractured gospel message, this idea that the gospel over time has really created a rift, or not created, has grown fractured, broken. The gospel message, as widely known, is by and large threatening to Jewish people, especially if you take the very conventional, like old school medieval Catholic Christian version of the gospel. It's incredibly threatening to a Jewish person.
What? That God divorced his chosen people. He said, "You're always mine, always and forever," except now you really messed up this time. So now you lost it. You had your chance. But don't worry, now that the church has our chance, we won't mess it up, and we definitely won't get replaced by someone else. That's a really good foundation to build build your faith on. A God that changes.
We're better than them. So it's fractured, and so the goal of the book is to kind of, try to pull the fracture back together and I guess suture, sew, heal, put everything back in its context, and that's a big thing here. But particularly for the way the Jewish ear hears the message, and bringing that focus back to where the gospel's focal point is in Jerusalem. Whereas in the conventional Christian definition of the gospel, it's highly individualistic. It very much focuses on the individual as a person, and not as the nation of the Jewish people, the citizenship with Israel, the restoration of Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the temple. These are all parts of the gospel message that are completely left out, if not totally forgotten, in most conventional definitions of the gospel message. So this book really works hard to return to that original fullness of the gospel message. That's why he keeps using the word Basora and not gospel, because the word gospel has presuppositions in a Christian individualistic mindset that don't exist with bringing in a new word that has a Hebrew root, and so it kind of like reshifts the focus back to, okay, there's actually a Jewish centrality to this whole book.
I like there's a 7-point summary. He actually quotes a guy named Dowerman. They call it the Ezekiel agenda. It's on page 157, but on your tablet, I'm not sure.
What chapter is it?
I believe it's in the last chapter. Yes, it's in the last chapter. It essentially says, as the Ezekiel agenda, it's a 7-part summary of the destiny of Israel. And they are the ingathering of the Jewish people to our homeland, Israel, the restoration of the unity of the people of Israel, repentance, renewal for the people as a whole, Messiah reigning in the center of this gathered people, Torah living as communal life of this people, national experience of divine presence, and because of all this, and in the light of the nations, vindication of the Jewish people as the people of God and the God of Israel as faithful to these promises. And basically, he goes on to say that if any of those pieces are left out, you're not telling it in its totality.
Yep, I was able to pull up the page. If you're wondering, it is it's location number like 6,387. Kindle's
That's good. That's like, hey, we should use Celsius too. Like when we're just making things up, we might as well. I use freedom
as
units.
an Irishman who used to use Celsius, I'm hurt.
freedom units over here.
I think Fahrenheit makes a lot more sense, especially given like quick rant. We all know that like dads will fight over the temperature being adjusted from 69 to 71, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
All of that between 69 Fahrenheit and 71 Fahrenheit is just 20 degrees Celsius. That whole thing, that whole span is 3 degrees. And so it's like, you can't just, even in our own homes in Ireland, we use Fahrenheit for the home temps because it's more precise. It makes more sense.
It's for people, it's like a measurement. It's like a foot. I can understand a foot. What, a meter? I've never seen a meter. I don't know what a meter is.
A meter is like, it's like a cubit and some change.
Oh, that's super helpful.
Yeah, an Egyptian cubit.
Oh, okay. That makes I was confused for a second.
All right, so now we can get to the parts where we talk about stuff that we like. So, how about, I feel like I've been doing a lot of talking, and you are very pretty and your face is very symmetrical, but you're not here for just your looks. You're here for your opinion as well. So things you like.
Things I like. I definitely like the emphasis on the prophetic message being on for salvation for both Israel and the nations, especially because the audience was a little ambiguous for me for who this was written to. I would assume a Christian audience, but it's to a Christian audience to hopefully get into the hands of a Jewish audience. I would assume, not that it's being done in a proselytory way. It's just this Basora, the gospel, is good news for the Jewish people. They need to know this. But because it's written to a Christian audience, I'm assuming the replacement theology thing really needed to be combated. And that's why I think the middle section of this book, where you and I, Seamus, don't subscribe to replacement theology, it's kind of like, yes, I understand. Yes, good. Yes, they have not been replaced.
I get it.
Right. And tied with that is the irrevocable covenant identity of the Jewish people. When God says something, he means it, and it's not going to change. Mm-hmm. So, and then I'll do a little plug. I do enjoy that he quotes Acts 3:15, calling Yeshua the author of life, which can have different implications about what does that mean? How is he the author of life? I enjoyed that.
All right.
We'll just leave it.
I see what you're doing. You're here to try and sabotage my video. No, a lot of good. So I actually have a lot of good things to say. One thing I really like is the shift. So, as I said, each of the Gospels have their own unique voice. And I really like that he focuses on Luke Acts and shows you what Luke's goal is, what his voice is, what his focus is in his gospel narrative. Because that's often like just as an example, if you take any reenactment of the crucifixion, you're actually going to get a conglomeration of all four Gospels, rolled into one. And so at the very end of his life, he basically says, his last words are slightly different from each gospel. And in like a reenactment, it's all thrown together, all as one big part. And that's very likely what could have happened. The multiple attestation aspect of that is important. Because, he probably said a lot of things. He probably wasn't just sitting there silently hanging the whole time. But what words are chosen to be recorded in each gospel is indicative of the goal that gospel is trying to focus on. So the gospels were never really trying to be inaccurate, like this is 100% the history. The gospels have a sort of religious agenda. They're like, hey, Jesus was like Luke is very focused on like this prophetic nature of Yeshua. So he presents Jesus in a very prophetic way, like you would Isaiah, right? Like this very upstanding, holy person. He has visions, he speaks like a prophet, and so he's very disciplined. I think it's in Luke's gospel where the note is made that when he was receiving his lashes, that he made not a sound. I think that's Luke makes that.
Trying to draw the sheep analogy, the sheep silent before it's sure.
Yeah, it's a couple of things. It's the sheep silent before the slaughter, but it's also this. You get the impression from Luke's gospel alone that Yeshua is just sitting there taking it, and he's incredibly strong. His discipline is really on point here. He's not wailing, he's not screaming in pain. He's just taking it in. And it, that adds to this sort of like, he's a prophetic figure. He's a very disciplined, holy man, and physical pain is just a thing that he deals with as an inconvenience at best, it's kind of, there's a goal. And so what I like about what this book does is it introduces you to the idea that the Bible has many voices. I've said on the channel before, I don't subscribe to the one voice theology. That's this idea that the whole Bible is a single voice. And that's actually very popular. A lot of people don't realize that they read the Bible like that. And that's where you see a lot of people complain about contradictions between two passages, like in Samuel or Kings, and the difference in certain numbers and stuff. And if you read the Bible thinking it's written all in a single voice, that's going to be problematic. But when you realize the Bible is actually a compendium, it's a library of many books written by very different people, spanning, thousands of years of history and cultures. You can't do that. You can't read it as a single voice. It's imperative that you read each book within the voice it was meant to be read in.
Right.
And that's not to say that doesn't get rid of the contradictions, but it helps resolve certain conflicts that would otherwise not be a problem unless you insert it into a single voice theology.
The truth still comes through. You see Mark is a little bit more terse. John is a little bit more preachy. I mean, if you're going to have a shepherd writing a part and then you have nobility writing another part, it would be kind of weird to have like, wow, these guys sound exactly the same. They do on a message level, but not on a. It's not.
Yeah,
it's not like. And now I'm here. It's like, all right, he's guiding. He's helping. He's inspiring. That's why it's called inspired, right?
Yeah. The nice thing about having difficulties, they're not contradictions. A lot of the times they're just difficulties.
Yeah.
Which is not the same thing as a contradiction. The nice thing about that is it proves multiple attestation. It proves that these are, in fact, unique and individual, multiple different viewpoints of the same event. And the skeleton is there, right? So that the skeleton is exactly the same. But the way certain details look might differ from one point of view from another. Or the problem could simply be spotlighting. It's this idea that certain gospel recounts are focused on a particular detail that another gospel did not mention. Some people might say, well, that's a contradiction because this passage says one thing and this guy says it was this detail is not even mentioned in Mark. Well, that's not a problem. That just means Luke noticed a thing that Mark didn't care to write down. Just as an example. But yeah, so that's one thing I like it as a historian. That really I really liked that because that's something I tend to explain a lot when interpreting different passages from the different gospels. I feel like I always have to remind people, like, well, this is from Luke's gospel, so this is his goal, this is his voice, this is his overarching message, this is how he talks. With that in mind, now let's interpret the passage, right? And so I'm always doing that, and so I like that he does that. He doesn't spend a whole lot of time making a big, scholastic fuss about it, but it's there, and so I do like that. Another thing I liked was and you wrote it down too, a good critique of replacement theology.
Yes.
So that's your show notes. So why don't you go into it?
Well, oh, the replacement theology part?
Yeah. Well, you don't have to go into it, but yeah, I'm reading your show notes. Haha. It is a good critique of replacement theology, and you also wrote, which rightfully needs to be rooted out of the church.
Yes. Get it rutted out. Rut.
Rutted? What did I say? Rooted? Rooted.
No, you said it right.
Okay. Yeah, and actually, you got a couple of things written here, and I did too. That was one of my focuses. Was this replacement theology? Because this book does spend a lot of time refocusing the shift of the gospel message to be inclusive of the Jewish people, because traditionally it's not been very inclusive.
Right.
In fact, I would say traditionally most Christians would like, if given the opportunity, to a Jew, instead of saying to a Jew, this is the gospel message and it applies to you too. A lot of the times the natural thing for many Christians to do would say something like, now you need to convert to Christianity, and pull them out of the Judaism. And of course we disagree with that. The book disagrees with that. And that's the thing that I like. Anything we're missing? Things that we like?
I mean, it's a really great book if someone has not, well, if you do think that the church has replaced the Jewish people, you definitely should. This is definitely a book for you, because that's an incorrect position.
So we have someone asking a brief overview of replacement theology. It's real quick. It's really quick. We do have a video dedicated to this concept in one of our it's an alternate media live we did a while ago. So we do have a more detail on this, but it's basically this idea that the church in the new covenant has replaced Israel, from the old covenants. This idea that they failed, and so because they failed, they've been pushed aside, and the church is now the receivers of the promise rather than the Jewish people. And so it basically, long story short, it makes God a liar when he says things like, the Jewish people are my treasured possession forever. It means God can change his mind when he makes a promise. It means he gave up on those promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's a lot of problems with it, but the biggest one is it's rooted in anti-Semitism. This is not the message of the New Testament. It's more the message of the Greco-Roman adoption of the gospel message as they became, as right around the same time, the Jewish people and Rome went to war. And so a lot of the heavily anti-Semitic aspects of replacement theology come from the fact that as the church was in the middle of growing, Rome was at war with Jerusalem. And so Jews were literally the enemy. And so to side with them in any way was treason and stuff like that. So there's a lot of ugly history there, but that's kind of a brief overview. Did I miss anything?
No, I mean, you can just see how much, Jesus was a Jew. You can see how much he wept over the city.
Yep.
He loves the Jewish people. It's ridiculous to think otherwise.
He came first to them. He even says. So, things I don't like. There's actually not a lot here. There's a lot, but there's not a lot in that. We don't have to spend a whole lot of time on the things that I don't like.
Sure.
Things I don't really like. I think this is a thing that you don't really like either. And I brought this up as we were doing the overview. The distinction in message of the gospel between Jew and Gentile. I don't like that.
I think it was page 92. It's the gospel's implications are different for Jewish and Gentile audiences.
Yeah. Is that basically two-house theology?
Yes. Yeah. It's the idea that the Jewish people, they have these set of things, and then the Gentiles have this sort of things. It's like, okay, well, the gospel message, it's about repentance from sin. All right, now do the things.
Yeah. As as you even pointed out with the what is it, the Dowerman notes on the Ezekiel list, the 7.
Yeah.
Torah living as a communal life of this people being one of the main parts. It's really weird. I think that, like, I get the temptation and I understand why, especially from Mark Kinzer, who works with FFOZ, and FFOZ has a fairly orthodox Jewish stance on this, that there is different, um, that the Jew and Gentile distinction needs to be continual and clear, and like, which means you should live completely differently in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I get why I think he's going that route, and I don't know if he was raised in a Jewish home. I can't remember if that's in his introduction. Whatever. So, but yeah, it's two house. It's this idea that, like, there's this sort of house of like the kingdom of God, and there are different rules for different people. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think me and I speak for the both of us when I say that we believe that this idea that there should be a practical distinction outside of, I'm literally, like, I'm Irish, so I'm obviously not Jewish in any hereditary way, but outside of that, there should not be a distinction between Jew and Gentile. It should very much be, you're a citizen now of the kingdom, and that's that.
I mean, the New Testament talks about we're grafted in, we're adopted, and
Yep.
never adopted a child. But it would be far-fetched to believe you bring a child in and you say, all right, you're a part of this family now. I mean, you can do whatever the heck you want. We're going to have our traditions over here. Like, if you want to join us on Christmas, like, that's up to you. It's like, no, get your butt down here. You're a part of the family now, which means you don't get to do certain things in this house. And there are blessings and curses. And if you're not getting those things, then it's like, it says, if you're not being chastised, are you, like, a good father is going to do that. And so you're going to want to participate.
Yeah, and I think that's why the New Testament has a very adoptive language. It's this idea that you have been essentially adopted into the citizenship of Israel, Ephesians 2, grafted in, as you said, Romans 11. Excuse me. And so, yeah, if you're adopted, well, then that makes you a son or a child. And yeah, so I don't like this idea that there's a double standard. It's pretty common within pretty large messianic movements anyway. I don't really fault him for it, but because it's a thing I don't like, it's something that I have to point out in this book, that you're going to see that. And it is something that I disagree with personally. I see it all the time. It's easy for me to basically just read over it and ignore it and go, yeah, whatever. I've seen the argument before. That's not a good argument, but I'm not going to, waste too much time on it.
No.
But yeah, that's a main thing I didn't like. And it's part 2 is also, I mean, it's not something I don't like. The book is very simple. It's really easy reading. You're not reading E.P. Sanders. You're not reading, you're not reading Matthew Henry or Mark Heiser. You're not reading, like, these really scholastic pieces. It's a very user-friendly book. It's almost too user-friendly. And I only say that because I think, like we said, Russell Resnik, I think he really goes out of his way to make it read more like sometimes you're reading a novel rather than just giving some of the information that we want.
And to his credit, there were probably people who, if it was any other way, wouldn't get through it at all. So as long as that's why there's the option, right? You can read the full, you go to the back and here's if you want to read, what is it? Jerusalem Crucified. Like, you can do that. You can dive into that if you want.
Yeah. And Mark is clear in his original version of the book, Jerusalem Crucified. It's very robotic. It's very precise. It's theological language. It's basically a thesis, much more dense than this book is. I have not read it yet. I want to. I'm putting it off because after reading Basora, it's like, I think I get the idea. and I don't want to just read the same book twice, which I've already done for this show. But that being said, even though it's a thing I don't like, and we did put it in the book club for a reason. So we are following a curriculum here at the book club. And the main thing I wanted people to get out of this book was that the focus of the gospel, right? So we talked about it a little bit in Restoration and even in the Elementary Principles book. But I think this book does a really good job, whether you're a super, super, super beginner or you're at that kind of intermediate, you're familiar, maybe you've been walking in the Torah walk for a little while and you're familiar with like a Hebrew concept of certain things. This book is not for the advanced reader, I don't think. But at the very least, it helps refocus the gospel. Like what when we say this word, what do we really mean by it? And this book is a good way of illustrating what we mean by that word when we say this word. So for me, that's a key takeaway. If you have a
I mean, if you're talking to people and they are really confused about the gospel or have no context whatsoever, there's parts of this that you could quote to people and they go, "Oh, okay, that makes sense. It's a good argument." Versus their eyes glazing over and they're like, what do you mean penal substitutionary atonement? I'm just kidding. There's no PSA in this book. That was yesterday's episode.
Yep. Yeah. So that's the key takeaway for me is, well, it's a couple of things. The historical reading of Luke, reading it as being, Luke's voice and how he's trying to present the gospel message. And then, of course, the way that we're reshaping that definition in its entirety. Let me see here. So I'm just looking over some of my highlighted points. Let us see. Yeah, most of my highlights we've already gone over. We revealed Basora concerning the death and resurrection of Jesus simultaneously. Yeah, a lot of that stuff. Introduction is actually pretty good. I got nothing else for key takeaways. So that being said, not a very long book. It's like 200 pages, right? 202 pages.
Well, on your Kindle, maybe it's like 150 for a book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, 160.
Wow.
Yeah.
On the Kindle, it has location codes instead of page numbers. So
that'll beef it up.
Yeah, let me see here. So according to my Kindle, it has nope. It has the location of what, 3,617?
Your font like 72. You're like
4,372. So the way the location codes work is every certain number of words is a new location code. And the reason they do that for Kindles is because you can change the font size. And so instead of doing page numbers, if you increase the font size, then the page numbers increase. And then it's actually difficult to figure out what page you're supposed to be on because it doesn't work that way. It's not pages. It's basically a long, unending document in which you can make certain adjustments and highlights. So every certain number of words, they just put a location code there. And so if you're like, I want to go to chapter 1 in the beginning, that's a location code instead of a page number, because the page number would be changing all the time depending on your font size and all that stuff. Yeah. Most Kindle books will still have a corresponding page number. Like, hey, if you were reading the real book, this information would be on this page. This did not have that, unfortunately. But that's fine. It is what it is. So we got a couple of questions, actually. Would you ask Kinzer Resnik any questions if you could? Ooh.
Oh boy. I could probably ask him. I think it was Resnik said, and maybe this is a really bad. I thought he said something like he had a hippie upbringing. I'm sure he has more stories, taken across, running into quite a few characters. So I'd like to hear him tell a story. Another one.
If I could ask I think Kinzer, I'm familiar with other of his works, and he usually is very scholarly in his writings, and I respect him a lot. I like reading his stuff. If I could ask him, I'd like to sit down and have a coffee and talk about the two house sort of theology and like really have because I get the argument, but I don't, I don't really see its validity in its entirety without sacrificing a big part of the gospel message, which
they just defended and like
So like, if I could ask him, it's like I just I get the arguments, I understand your position, but I'm having a hard time reconciling how you don't see this being an issue. So, and I'm sure you've thought about this because Mark is an incredibly smart guy. So since I'm assuming you have thought about this problem, walk me through it, please, so that I have a better understanding of your side.
Do you think it's possible that he would take the position, and obviously we're just speculating here, that at the consummation of all things, it will be the same with the Torah reigning and flowing out of Jerusalem? But right now it's kind of a, if you're a slave, stay a slave. If you're free, stay free situation. I could imagine him trying to explain it that way. Not that I fully agree with it, because you're supposed to, like, you're a new creation now, like welcome to the family.
You're a citizen of the kingdom now, live like it.
Yeah.
Huh. Possibly. That's a good thought. And then what surprised you most about the book?
I was surprised I got it for free.
Nice.
Subscribe, hit the like button, join the after parties or whatever.
I swear we didn't even pay him, so
that's true.
Okay, so now for the final bit, and then we'll call it a day, as we're a little over time. So the book rating, you know how it is, we do things here. Bobby, actually, you came up with this rating system on the very first book club episode. So instead of doing stars, we do seats. There are 4 seat. 1 is obviously not super good. 2, but somewhere between 2 and 3 is average in the middle, and then 4 is highly. And of course, you can have like a 4 would recommend or highly recommend, or a 3 would recommend, but however you want to throw that seat rating in. But what are you going to rate this book out of 4 seats?
For myself, I would rate it 2 out of 4 seat. If there was a new believer, I would rate it a 3 out of 4. There's just so many books out there. It's a good book. There's a lot of books out there that I'm like, man, I have on my docket that I got to read. I wouldn't bump this one up to hit it before the other ones. So I'm going to give it a 2 out of 4. It's a good book.
Wow.
But yeah, I don't want to be too liberal about my seat. I think the past 2 have been 4 out of 4.
Well, the past 2 have been fantastic, honestly. So the way I rate, I think it's a 3 for me, 3 seats. I think it's a good book. The premise is good. The information is good. Are there better books for this out there? Yeah. But are there books that address this issue precisely and only? I think this is that book. So if you're like, you can get this information from Restoration, but Restoration has a different goal. And so you're going to get this information, but within a different context of other informations and goals. Same with Elementary Principles. And those are great books. Those books are like, there's a reason I give them 4 out of 4. It's just like, those are the go-to beginner books. But I still think that this, considering that there's not a lot of material out there for this specific topic, I think that he is treading in waters that are more or less where people aren't swimming. Even if it is in the shallow end, there's still not a lot of people there. And so this book provides an avenue for those who might not yet either be ready for something like Restoration, where it's a lot of information all at once, or they just need, they have read Restoration, but they still need that thing to show them, hey, this is what the gospel really looks like. Like you have Restoration, you have Elementary Principles, great. But we really haven't spent a lot of time focusing on what the gospel, like what that kind of is. You probably have an idea now that you have a more Hebrew mindset going into this, but this is a good way of like putting it in words for people who may not have thought about it too deeply, even if they have a better book for some of this information. Like, again, part 2 is mostly stuff that you can get out of Restoration. So if you've read Restoration, part 2 is kind of useless to you. But I don't think it's a completely useless book. So I'm going to give it 3.
Hey, and you know, the tzitzit, just one tzitzit is going to remind you of all the commandments. So
fair enough. Well, okay. We're, a little over the hour. That's fine. I think we're good to go. We're good to wrap things up. Unless there's anything that you
no,
for your final thoughts. I think we're all set.
No, it's a good book. Read it.
Or don't. I don't care what you do.
I mean, off my back.
Well, that about does it for the book review. Thanks for all of you who joined us live, for all the viewers. Really appreciate you hanging out with us. If you liked, as Bobby said, if you liked what you saw here, if you want more of this, bless the like button, believe in the subscribe button.
Wait, do you want them to click it or just like think about it? You want them to actually click the button?
I want them to have faith in the button.
I'm going to go with they're going to click it.
Faith without clicks is dead. Anyway, that about does it for us for the rest of the night. Bobby, thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
It's actually kind of nice to discuss the book in tandem with somebody. So, and plus you did win this book. So that's also cool.
I did win this book. So.
No, but I really appreciate it. It's good to have you on, Mr. Smiley. And now everyone here has met him. You met the myth, the legend, the meme lord himself. All right. Have you got something to l'chaim to? All right, everyone. Have a good night. Thanks for joining us. L'chaim.
L'chaim.